The world had changed forever, reduced to a barren wasteland where echoes of humanity's once great civilization now only whispered in the wind. Cities, once bustling with life, lay in ruin, their skeletal structures serving as a grim reminder of a time long past. The skies, perpetually tinged with the haze of smog and smoke, offered little hope to those who survived. Survivors. They were few and far between now, hiding in the shadows of what was left, scavenging whatever they could find in a world where survival had become a brutal game. The war against the undead had left its mark on the land, on the people, and on the very essence of life itself. Once, the undead were a plague to be feared, mindless creatures that had no purpose other than to consume the living. But in the aftermath of the war, they had evolved, becoming something darker, more intelligent, and infinitely more dangerous. The creatures now roamed the earth, starved and vicious, their minds only focused on one thing: survival. A small group of survivors had found shelter in an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of a once thriving city. Among them was a woman named Ava, hardened by loss and the brutal reality of the world around her. Her eyes, a pale blue that once held the spark of hope, were now clouded with the weight of what had happened. She had lost everything: her family, her friends, her home. All that remained was the drive to survive. Ava had learned to adapt quickly to the new world order. She knew that every day could be her last, and so she had become cold, calculating. But there was a part of her that still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn things around. She wasn't alone in her thoughts. Inside the crumbling walls of the hospital, there were others: Jared, a former military medic with a grim outlook on life; Beth, a young woman whose innocence had long been shattered by the horrors she had witnessed; and Ray, an older man who had seen too much of the world to trust anyone or anything. They all had their reasons for surviving, but they shared one thing in common: they had all been touched by the horrors of the Undead War. The group had been living in the hospital for what felt like an eternity, relying on whatever supplies they could scavenge from nearby towns. Every day was a struggle, a battle against hunger, illness, and the constant threat of the undead. But it wasn't the undead that worried Ava most. It was the other survivors, the desperate, starving people who had turned to violence in order to survive. They were just as dangerous as the zombies, maybe even more so. One evening, as the group huddled around a small fire in the hospital's courtyard, Jared spoke up. "We can't stay here much longer," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "We're running out of supplies, and the undead are getting smarter. They're moving in packs now, and they're not as easy to avoid." Ava nodded, her gaze fixed on the flames. "I know. But where do we go? Everywhere we've looked is either overrun or too dangerous to approach." Beth, who had been silent until now, spoke softly. "There has to be somewhere. Maybe there's a place where the undead can't reach us. A sanctuary." Ray snorted, a bitter smile on his face. "Sanctuary? You're talking about a fairy tale. There's no such place anymore." Ava didn't respond immediately. She had heard all the talk of safe havens, places where survivors could rebuild, where the undead were kept at bay. But those stories were always just that, stories. The reality was much harsher. People had tried to create safe zones, only to have them fall apart in a matter of weeks. Trust had become a commodity more precious than food or water. She stood up, her expression hardening. "We'll leave tomorrow. We can't keep hiding here forever. There's got to be something left out there, somewhere we can make a stand." Jared hesitated. "What if it's worse out there? What if the undead have changed again, evolved even further?" Ava's eyes flickered with the fire's glow. "Then we adapt. Like we always do." As the night wore on, the group fell silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The decision had been made. They would leave the hospital at dawn, seeking whatever might be left of the world outside. It was a desperate move, but it was the only move they had. Little did they know, the real nightmare was only beginning. The Undead War had left the land scarred, but the true horrors that awaited them out there, creatures unlike any they had faced before, would test the limits of their survival. And in a world where every day was a fight, survival was no longer a guarantee. Tomorrow, they would step into the unknown, hoping against hope that they could find a place where they might survive, at least long enough to see another day. The first light of dawn broke through the decaying skyline, casting long shadows over the ruined city as Ava and the others prepared to leave their shelter. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of decay and the weight of impending danger. The decision to leave the hospital had been made, but none of them knew what awaited them outside. The world beyond the crumbling walls was no longer familiar, and the undead were only a small part of the threat they faced now. Ava packed her gear methodically, checking her weapons and supplies. The hospital had provided a temporary refuge, but they couldn't stay hidden forever. As much as she feared what lay beyond the city, she knew they had no choice. If they stayed, they'd eventually run out of food, and even worse, they might become easy targets for other survivors desperate for what little they had left. Jared, ever the pragmatist, was already ready to go, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his medical supplies secured. His eyes, hardened by the brutality of the past few months, scanned their surroundings, always on the lookout for potential threats. He was the group's unofficial leader, calm, collected, and strategic. But Ava could see the cracks in his armor. Even Jared had his doubts. "Everything's packed," he said, his voice low. "Are we ready?" Ava nodded, glancing over at Ray, who was adjusting his worn-out boots. Ray had been a man of few words since they'd met, his stoic demeanor belying the pain and loss he had experienced. There was no telling what kind of life he had led before the apocalypse, but now, all that mattered was survival. Beth, who had been quiet all morning, shifted nervously beside them. "Do you really think we'll find anything out there?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I mean, what's left of the world? It's been years since the war. What if it's all gone?" Ava met her gaze, offering a faint but reassuring smile. "We won't know unless we try." The group gathered their belongings, the weight of their packs and the uncertainty of the journey ahead weighing heavily on their shoulders. As they stepped outside the hospital, the harsh reality of the world hit them in full force. The streets were desolate, littered with debris, abandoned cars, and the remnants of a civilization that had once been vibrant and full of life. Now, it was all just ashes, ashes of a forgotten world. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows, careful not to make too much noise. The undead had grown more intelligent in recent months, forming packs that hunted with purpose. And there were whispers of even more terrifying creatures, mutations, horrors that had adapted to the apocalypse in ways no one could have predicted. The group walked in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The air was oppressive, the silence broken only by the occasional distant groan or the scraping sound of something moving in the distance. Ava's hand hovered near her weapon, her instincts on high alert. She knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down, not for a second. They passed through the outskirts of the city, the buildings becoming fewer and farther between as they ventured deeper into the wasteland. The landscape was desolate, the earth cracked and dry, devoid of any sign of life. The once green fields were now nothing but dust and dirt, a harsh reminder of the destruction that had swept through the world. Beth stumbled, her foot catching on a piece of rubble, and Ray was quick to steady her. "Watch your step," he muttered, his tone rough. Ava glanced back at the others, taking in the weary expressions on their faces. They were exhausted, physically and mentally, but they couldn't afford to stop. Not now. They had to keep moving forward. After hours of walking, they reached a clearing at the edge of the city. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red hue across the horizon. The group set up camp in the clearing, making the best of their limited resources. There was little to do except rest, eat what little food they had, and prepare for the next leg of their journey. As they sat around the small fire, Ava stared into the flames, her mind racing. What had happened to the world? How had it all fallen apart so quickly? The undead war had come and gone, but in its wake, the world had been left shattered. And now, they were nothing more than scavengers in a ruined world. Jared spoke again, breaking the silence. "We'll keep heading west," he said, his voice steady. "There are rumors of a safe zone out there, some kind of fortified community. It's a long shot, but it's the only chance we have." Ava didn't respond immediately. She didn't want to give him false hope, but she knew they couldn't just wander aimlessly. They needed a destination, something to cling to in this desolate world. Even if the safe zone was nothing more than a rumor, it was better than nothing. Beth looked up at the darkening sky, her face drawn with exhaustion. What if it's a trap? She asked. What if the people there aren't any better than the ones we've met? Ray's eyes flickered with distrust. The world isn't kind anymore, he muttered. But we don't have much choice. Ava sighed, the weight of their journey pressing down on her. We'll take the risk. We have no other choice but to keep moving forward. As night fell, the group huddled around the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows on their faces. Outside the circle of warmth, the wasteland stretched out endlessly, a dark, unforgiving void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The world was dead, and the only thing that mattered now was survival. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey, hoping that somewhere out there, amidst the ashes, there was a future worth fighting for. The morning came with a biting wind, harsh and unrelenting as it swept across the barren landscape. Ava awoke to the sound of rustling leaves and the distant groans of the undead. She had barely slept, resting was a luxury no longer afforded in a world where danger lurked at every corner. Her body ached, and her mind was heavy with the weight of their uncertain future. Still, she knew they couldn't waste time. They had to keep moving. Jared, already awake and sharpening his knife, glanced at Ava. We need to be on the move before midday, he said, his tone flat. The undead are more active in the evening, and we don't want to risk running into a pack. Ava nodded, rising to her feet and stretching her stiff muscles. She exchanged a quick glance with Ray and Beth, who were slowly waking from their fitful sleep. Beth looked as fragile as ever, her wide eyes betraying the fear she tried so hard to hide. Ray, though older, seemed the least affected by the hardships of their journey. His years of survival instinct had turned him into a quiet, reliable presence, one that the group depended on more than they realized. The day's journey started uneventfully, as they made their way westward. The wind howled, pushing them forward, as the sky remained a dull gray, casting a haunting pallor over everything they passed. Every step they took through the wasteland was a reminder of how little was left. The land was cracked and dry, offering no solace, no sanctuary. Ava kept a close watch on the horizon, her heart thudding with every distant noise. The air felt heavy, and the silence was oppressive. Even the usual hum of insects or rustle of small creatures was absent. It felt as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. They walked for hours without encountering anything noteworthy, no undead, no survivors, nothing. The sense of unease that had settled within Ava's chest seemed to grow with every passing mile. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, just as they were about to rest for a break, they heard it. The unmistakable sound of dragging footsteps. Low groans. The familiar, spine-chilling noises of the undead closing in. Ava's heart rate spiked as she motioned for the others to stop. Quiet, she whispered, her voice barely a breath against the wind. The group froze in place, trying to blend into the surroundings. It was a futile attempt, but they had no choice. Jared's eyes narrowed, scanning the area. They're close, he muttered. Too close. Beth's breath hitched in her chest. How many? Ray gestured toward a nearby ruined building. Head for cover, now. The group swiftly moved to the relative safety of the collapsed structure, where they crouched low behind a pile of debris. Ava could feel her pulse pounding in her throat as the undead drew nearer, their moans growing louder. The air was thick with their fetid stench, and Ava's stomach churned at the thought of being caught in the open. As the creatures approached, Ava's mind raced. How had they managed to stay so quiet for so long? Had they been stalking them, waiting for the right moment to pounce? The undead were relentless, driven by hunger for the living. Ava's hand tightened around her weapon, but she held still. She knew better than to engage without a plan. Jared, ever the strategist, scanned the area with a trained eye. His voice was a low whisper. There are 4 of them, maybe 5. They don't look too smart. We can slip by if we're careful. Ava's gaze darted from one end of the ruined building to the other. The undead were moving slowly, aimlessly, but their hunger was palpable. They would tear into anything they found, regardless of how weak or injured it was. The group was in the middle of the food chain now, and the idea of becoming prey was a constant, gnawing fear. "We wait for them to pass," Ava said, her voice steady despite the rising panic in her chest. "Then we move out quickly." The silence felt like it lasted forever as the group held their breath, watching the undead shuffle past them. The creatures' grotesque forms were barely visible through the debris, but their presence was suffocating. Ava could feel her muscles tightening, her limbs stiffening from the strain of staying completely still. Each passing second felt like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the undead shuffled farther away, their groans fading into the distance. Ava let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, and the group silently exhaled a collective sigh of relief. "We move," Jared whispered, his voice firm. They made their way quickly, keeping to the shadows and avoiding any open spaces. Their hearts were still pounding from the close encounter, but they pushed forward. No matter the cost, they had to keep going. There was no turning back. As they continued westward, the landscape around them seemed to grow even more barren. The occasional skeleton of a fallen tree was all that marked the passage of time. Their supplies were running low, and hunger gnawed at their bellies. The group was moving slower now, fatigue and the toll of constant fear weighing on them. After hours of trekking through the wasteland, they came across a narrow, dried-up riverbed. It seemed like a good place to stop for a rest, and the lack of immediate threats made it feel like a rare moment of peace. But peace was fleeting in this world. A distant, horrifying screech echoed across the riverbed. Ava's heart sank as the sound sent chills down her spine. The undead had never been quite this loud before. What could it be? Ava turned to her group. "We need to move. Now." The echo of that chilling screech reverberated through the wasteland, a sound so unnatural it felt like it had been torn from the very fabric of reality itself. Ava's skin prickled as she instinctively tightened her grip on her weapon. The others tensed beside her, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. The undead had always been a constant threat, but this was something different. The screech was not the low groan of a zombie, nor the slow, dragging footsteps of the mindless horde. No, this was something more intelligent, more vicious. What was that? Beth's voice was barely a whisper, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Ava didn't respond immediately. She was too focused on the sounds around them, on the unnatural stillness that had settled in the air after the screech. The wind had died down, and all that could be heard now was the faint rustling of dry leaves underfoot and the distant sounds of the wasteland. Yet, there was an unmistakable tension in the atmosphere, a warning that something was about to happen. Jared, his brow furrowed in concentration, scanned the area. His voice was low but urgent. "Stay close. Whatever made that sound, we don't want to be anywhere near it." Ava's heart was pounding. She knew what Jared was implying. There were stories, horror stories whispered by the few survivors still clinging to life, of mutated undead, creatures that had evolved beyond the mindless hunger of the typical zombies. These new horrors were faster, smarter, and deadlier. If that screech was anything to go by, they had just walked into the territory of something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The group quickly fell into formation, moving cautiously along the edge of the riverbed. Ava kept her senses sharp, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The last thing they needed was to be caught off guard again. She had seen too many friends fall to the undead, and she wasn't about to let it happen to her new companions. Ray, ever the realist, muttered, "We're not gonna outrun whatever made that noise. It's hunting us. I can feel it." Ava nodded, her gut twisting at his words. The wasteland had already become a nightmare, and now it seemed like the hunt had shifted in their favor. She couldn't help but wonder if they were truly the prey, if they were destined to be the next victims in this world gone wrong. They moved forward at a steady pace, keeping low to the ground and trying to make as little noise as possible. Every crack of a branch or scrape of gravel underfoot sent Ava's heart into overdrive. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Hours passed without incident, but the uneasy feeling didn't subside. Ava kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. But nothing came. The only sounds were the occasional wind gust and the distant rattle of bones and wreckage. As they continued, the landscape shifted. The desolate earth began to give way to strange, twisted shapes, remnants of trees with gnarled, broken branches that seemed to claw at the sky like hands of the dead. It was as if the world had begun to warp in response to the horrors unleashed by the apocalypse. This place felt unnatural, even by the standards of the wasteland. Then, they saw it. A figure appeared on the horizon, faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. It was too far away to make out any details, but Ava felt a chill crawl down her spine as she realized what she was seeing. A group of undead, but not like the ones they had encountered before. These creatures moved with an unnerving coordination, as though they were being led by something else, something guiding them like puppets on strings. Ava's instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew that would only make them more of a target. The only choice was to fight, and fight fast. "Get ready," Jared hissed, his voice tight with tension. "Stay together. If we're gonna make it out of here, we need to keep our heads." The group crouched low, moving into the cover of a half-collapsed building at the edge of the riverbed. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, her hands slick with sweat as she prepared for the worst. Whatever this was, they couldn't afford to take chances. If they were to survive, they would have to outsmart the undead, outlast them, and hope they could find shelter before the creatures closed in. As they watched from their hiding spot, the creatures drew nearer. They were different, faster, more purposeful. Their eyes burned with an unnatural hunger, and their movements were precise, like the careful steps of predators stalking their prey. There was no mindlessness here, these were creatures of strategy, guided by some primal instinct Ava couldn't fully comprehend. "We need to move." "Now," Ray muttered, his voice strained with fear. Jared looked over at Ava, his jaw clenched. "We make a break for it. Stay low, stay quiet, and don't stop running until we're out of their range." Ava nodded, her pulse racing. They were being hunted, but they weren't done yet. They couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to falter. The wasteland was a land of death, and only those who were quick and smart enough survived. With one final glance at the approaching predators, Ava made the decision. "Let's go. Now." The group burst from their hiding place, sprinting as fast as they could through the broken terrain, their breaths ragged and urgent. Behind them, the sound of the undead closing in echoed in the air, like a pack of ravenous wolves chasing down their prey. The hunt was on, and this time, it wasn't just the undead doing the hunting. The wind howled as the group sprinted through the desolate wasteland, their footsteps scattering dry leaves and debris in every direction. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, each breath a desperate gasp as she pushed herself harder, faster, her legs burning with exhaustion. The sounds of the undead, those unnatural, haunting growls, grew louder with every passing second. It felt like the world itself was closing in on them. Behind her, she could hear the others, their heavy breathing mixing with the pounding of their feet against the cracked earth. Ray's voice, ragged and strained, broke through the chaos. "Keep moving. Don't look back." Ava didn't need telling twice. She forced herself to focus ahead, blocking out the fear creeping into the edges of her mind. Looking back would only slow them down. But even then, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder once, just once, to see the horrors that were following them. The undead were no longer the slow, lumbering creatures they'd faced before. These things were different. Their limbs moved with frightening speed, their bodies jerking unnaturally as they sprinted after them like predators on a hunt. And leading them, Ava noticed, was one in particular. It was taller, its movements more controlled, its eyes gleaming with an eerie intelligence. The others followed its every step, as though it was the leader, coordinating their every movement. It was like they were no longer a mindless horde, but a pack of beasts, united in purpose. Ava's stomach twisted in fear. They couldn't outrun that thing. It was too fast, too relentless. "Jared." Ava shouted, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to find somewhere to hide." Jared's face was grim as he shot a glance back, his eyes narrowing. "We need a diversion. Now." The riverbed they'd been following was narrowing, flanked on either side by jagged rocks and sparse, skeletal trees. There was no cover, no way to outmaneuver the creatures in open terrain. Their only hope was to make it to a larger cluster of ruined buildings up ahead. But the undead were closing in, and the distance was too great. Ava's mind raced. They needed a way to buy time, something, anything, to slow the creatures down. Her eyes darted to the rocks ahead, and an idea sparked in her mind. It was risky, but it might just work. "Ray! Over here!" Ava shouted as she sprinted toward a narrow crevice in the rocky outcrop beside the riverbed. She quickly wedged herself between two jagged rocks, her back pressed against the cold stone. It wasn't much, but it was something. The others followed her lead, slipping into the crevice just as the first of the undead came into view. The tall one was in the lead, its grotesque form moving with terrifying precision. It was closer now, much closer. Ava's breath caught in her throat as the creature passed by the rock, its grotesque form moving with a calculated purpose. She held her breath, praying that it wouldn't sense their presence. The undead didn't pause. They kept moving, their unnatural pace never faltering as they swept past the group's hiding spot. Ava couldn't help but watch the leader of the pack. It was like it was hunting with intent, not just mindlessly pursuing them. It knew they were close. It could smell them. The group huddled together in the cramped space, holding their breath, praying for the creatures to move past. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. The wind picked up again, howling through the narrow gorge, masking the sound of the undead's footsteps. Ava's pulse hammered in her ears as she strained her senses, desperate to hear if the creatures had moved on. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last of the undead shuffled past, its footfalls growing softer as it retreated. Ava slowly exhaled, her lungs burning for air she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "We need to move," Jared whispered urgently. "It won't be long before they realize we're not behind them." Ava nodded, her mind still reeling from the close call. They were alive, just barely, but the danger wasn't over. They were still being hunted, and if they didn't keep moving, they would be cornered. She motioned for the group to follow her, and they silently began to slip out of the crevice, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. They continued their journey, the looming ruins ahead offering a glimmer of hope. But as they neared the buildings, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. The only sound was the distant groans of the undead, now fading away into the wasteland. But there was something else. The tall creature, the one that had led the hunt, wasn't far behind. Ava could feel its presence like a shadow hovering just beyond her reach. It was patient. It was waiting. And it wasn't giving up. As the group neared the broken remains of a stone building, a low growl echoed through the air. Ava turned sharply, her eyes searching for the source of the sound. Her heart froze as she saw the creature standing at the far end of the ruins, watching them with those piercing eyes. It was time to face the truth. They weren't just being hunted, they were being tested. "Get to the building!" Jared barked, his voice filled with urgency. "Now!" They bolted, running with everything they had, heading for the cover of the crumbling structure. But Ava couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The creatures weren't just after them, they were after something more. And whatever that was, they would have to find it before it found them. The ruins loomed ahead like jagged teeth, their broken walls standing in stark contrast to the barren wasteland around them. Ava's legs burned from the sprint, but the fear that gripped her heart pushed her forward. She could hear the others behind her, their footsteps heavy and frantic as they followed in her wake. But even as they ran toward the shelter of the crumbling building, Ava knew they were not safe. That creature, the one leading the pack of undead, was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Its eyes had locked onto them, cold and unyielding, and it would not stop until it had what it was hunting. The group reached the base of the ruined structure, and Ava hesitated for a split second, scanning their surroundings for any immediate threats. The wasteland stretched out in all directions, empty and desolate. The buildings were long abandoned, their skeletal remains casting long shadows in the fading light. "Get inside," Jared urged, his voice low but commanding. "We need to regroup." Ava nodded, but her mind raced. Something about this place felt wrong. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the very ground beneath her feet was holding its breath. She turned toward the entrance of the building, stepping over fallen debris and broken glass. The others followed suit, moving cautiously, their eyes darting around as they entered the dark interior. Once inside, the group took a moment to catch their breath, their chests rising and falling with the effort. Ava's gaze swept across the room. It was a hollowed-out shell, the walls bare except for faded markings that hinted at some long-forgotten purpose. A staircase led to the upper floor, but it looked unstable, barely holding itself together. It didn't matter. They were inside for now, and that was all that mattered. But as they stood there, catching their breath, Ava couldn't shake the sense that they were not alone. "There's something here," she muttered, her voice tight with unease. Ray, standing at the far end of the room, squinted into the dim light. "I don't like it either. It feels like we're being watched." Jared, always the pragmatist, nodded. "Keep your eyes peeled. We don't know what's lurking in here." They spread out cautiously, each of them taking a corner of the room, their senses heightened. The oppressive silence pressed in around them, broken only by the soft echoes of their movement. Ava's eyes flicked to the shattered windows, half expecting to see the undead swarm outside, but there was nothing. The wasteland remained still, as though time itself had stopped. Ava's fingers tightened around the hilt of her weapon as she turned her attention to the staircase. She wasn't sure why, but something about the upper floor drew her in, a nagging curiosity pulling at her. "I'm going up," she said abruptly, her voice cutting through the silence. "Stay here." Jared glanced at her, a flash of concern crossing his face. "Ava, wait." "I'll be fine," she interrupted, her eyes narrowing as she took a step toward the stairs. "I'll only be a minute." Before anyone could argue, she ascended the staircase, her footsteps muffled by the rotting wood beneath her. Each step creaked, as if the building itself were protesting her presence. The darkness in the upper level was thicker, almost suffocating, but Ava pressed on, driven by that strange, overwhelming feeling that something important awaited her there. At the top of the stairs, she entered what looked like an old office. The air was stale, thick with dust. Papers were scattered across the floor, the remnants of a world long gone. Ava knelt down, sifting through the debris, her fingers brushing against a few faded documents. Most of the writing was illegible, but one thing caught her eye, a symbol etched into the corner of one of the pages. It was the same symbol she had seen carved into the walls of other ruins during her journey. It was subtle but unmistakable, a twisted, jagged circle. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what it meant. She had seen this symbol before, on the clothing of those mutated undead. The ones who had led the hunt. The ones that had chased them relentlessly. They were part of something, a larger plan. Ava stood up abruptly, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The tall, intelligent creature was not just hunting them. It was part of something much more organized, something that had been around long before the apocalypse had started. She had seen the symbol in multiple places now, all over the ruins of the old world. It was like a silent mark, a signature left by whoever, or whatever, had caused the devastation. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked, and Ava's heart skipped in her chest. She spun around to find Beth standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "You need to see this," Beth said quietly, her voice trembling. Ava followed her down the stairs, the unease in her gut growing with each step. When they reached the main room, the others were gathered around a map, its edges frayed and torn. Ray's finger hovered over a spot on the map, an area marked with the same symbol she had found upstairs. "It's a location," Ray said, his voice tight with disbelief. "A place where the undead are gathering. It's not just a random outbreak. This is coordinated." Ava felt her pulse quicken as she realized the true depth of what they were facing. This wasn't just a mindless zombie apocalypse. There was something more, something dark and orchestrated, pulling the strings behind the scenes. And now they had no choice but to uncover the truth before the undead could reach their next target. The hunt was no longer a random attack. It was a war, and the real battle was just beginning. The revelation hit Ava harder than any blow she had received since the outbreak began. This was no longer a fight for survival. This was a fight for the future of humanity, if anything that could still be called humanity existed. The undead were no longer aimless, random creatures. They were organized, driven by a force that controlled their every movement. And Ava realized, with chilling clarity, that the group had just stumbled upon the epicenter of that force. Ray's finger traced the symbol on the map again, his eyes wide with shock. "We have to go there," he muttered under his breath. "We have no choice." Ava nodded, feeling the weight of his words. Their path was clear. They could either remain hiding, hoping for a miracle, or they could go to the place on the map and try to understand what the undead were really after. But the deeper question loomed, could they survive it? Was there even anything left to save? "The coordinates are close," Beth said, her voice breaking through Ava's thoughts. She was looking at the map, her face pale but determined. "It's in a ravaged city a few miles west of here. We're running out of time." Ava clenched her fists. "We don't know what's waiting for us there. But we'll never find the answers if we stay here." Jared's jaw tightened as he stepped forward, his hand gripping the rifle slung across his chest. "Then it's decided. We move out. We stick together, and we don't look back." The group gathered their weapons, preparing to leave the ruined building that had offered only temporary shelter. The unsettling silence outside seemed to mock them, as if the wasteland itself was waiting for them to make the first move. Ava's pulse raced as she led the group through the crumbling streets, the map their only guide. She couldn't help but wonder what they were walking into. Were they marching toward their doom? Or was there something in that city that could still be salvaged? As they moved, the air grew heavier, the stench of decay and rot thickening around them. Ava glanced at her companions, Ray, Beth, Jared. All of them were trying to hide their fear behind steely expressions, but she could see it in their eyes. This was a mission none of them wanted to take on, but they had no choice. The map had led them here. They had to see it through. The ruins of the old city loomed in the distance, like a hollowed-out skeleton. Once a thriving metropolis, it had now been reduced to a maze of rubble and broken glass, a graveyard of human ambition. As they approached, Ava could feel the weight of the place pressing down on her chest. The air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy, as if the very earth had been altered by the presence of the undead. "Keep your guard up," Jared warned. His eyes darted from one crumbling building to the next, scanning every dark corner, every shadow that might conceal an ambush. Ava's senses were on high alert. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every sound seemed magnified in the oppressive quiet of the city, the scrape of their boots against the pavement, the distant caw of a raven, the unsettling creak of a fallen structure shifting in the wind. They reached a central square, the heart of the city. The buildings around them were destroyed beyond recognition, their facades hollowed out like rotten teeth. And then, Ava saw it, the unmistakable symbol, carved into the stone of a nearby column. It was the same one from the map, the same one she had found in the ruins of the office. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We found it." Ray stepped forward, examining the symbol closely. "I don't like this. It feels like they're marking the place. Like they want us to find it." Beth shook her head. "It can't be a coincidence. We've followed this symbol everywhere. It's like we're walking into their lair." Ava swallowed hard. She had to admit, Beth's words rang true. The closer they got to the source of the undead's strange intelligence, the more it felt like they were playing into something much darker than they had anticipated. And yet, they couldn't stop now. They were too deep into this mess to turn back. "We need to be careful," Ava said, her voice steady despite the growing fear inside her. "We're walking into something we don't understand." Suddenly, a low growl interrupted her thoughts. The sound echoed through the empty streets, reverberating off the shattered buildings. The group froze, instinctively reaching for their weapons. But there was no movement, nothing but the unsettling silence that followed. Then, they saw it. From the dark alleyways, figures began to emerge, more of the undead, but these were different. They were no longer the stumbling, mindless creatures they had encountered before. These zombies moved with purpose, their eyes glowing with a strange, unnatural light. And there, at the forefront, was the tall leader, the one that had been following them since the beginning. It was more than just a zombie. It had changed, mutated somehow. Its body was grotesquely elongated, its skin stretched tightly over its bones, as though it had been forcibly reshaped. Its eyes were no longer vacant but filled with an eerie intelligence, the same intelligence that had driven it to hunt them down. It was the mastermind, the key to whatever twisted purpose lay behind this apocalypse. Ava's heart raced as the creatures closed in. This was it. The moment of reckoning. The truth was no longer hidden. The undead weren't just here to survive, they were here to take control. And it was clear now that they had a master, a purpose. They were on the verge of discovering what that purpose was. But would they survive long enough to find the answers? Or had they walked into a trap from which there was no escape? "Ava, get ready," Jared hissed. "We fight, or we die." The final battle had begun. And in the silence that followed, Ava knew one thing for sure: their fate had already been sealed. The air was thick with tension as the horde of mutated undead closed in, their eerie, glowing eyes locked on Ava and her group. They were not mindless, aimless monsters anymore. These creatures were intelligent, coordinated, and driven by a singular, terrifying purpose. The tall, grotesque leader moved at the forefront, its unnatural form towering over the others. It watched them with a cold, calculating gaze, as if measuring them for some unspeakable task. Ava's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't allow fear to take control. She couldn't. She had come too far to let it consume her now. Behind her, she could hear the rest of the group shifting, their breath shallow as they prepared for what could very well be their last stand. "Ava!" Ray shouted, his voice urgent as he gripped his weapon. "We can't fight them all. We need a plan, now." Ava nodded sharply, her eyes never leaving the undead leader. "We fight smart," she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming odds. "We use the environment. Keep moving, and don't let them surround us." Jared crouched low, his rifle ready. "Let's do it." They couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The creatures closing in weren't like the zombies they had battled before. They were faster, stronger, and most terrifying of all, strategic. Ava knew they had to find the heart of this twisted force controlling the undead and take it down, or else the world they once knew would never stand a chance again. "Move!" Ava shouted. With a fierce battle cry, the group sprang into action. They moved quickly, using the fallen ruins and shattered columns for cover, darting between the wreckage as they fired their weapons. Each shot seemed to have little effect on the undead, those with the glowing eyes barely even flinched. They were resilient, and it was clear that the undead had adapted far beyond the primal, mindless state they were familiar with. Ava fired, hitting one of the creatures square in the chest. It faltered for a moment but didn't go down. Its gaze never left her, and it began to lurch forward, its pace quickening. "We need to take down their leader," she yelled to the group. "If we don't, it'll never stop." Beth nodded, her hands trembling as she aimed her weapon at the mutated leader. But before she could fire, the creature raised a hand, and suddenly, the air around them grew heavy. The undead surrounding them paused for just a moment, as if responding to some unseen command. Ava's blood ran cold. The leader was controlling them, directing them, like puppets on strings. "We have to get rid of it," Ava shouted, pushing forward. "Distract it." Ray and Jared moved in sync, drawing the undead leader's attention with a volley of gunfire while Ava and Beth flanked it from the other side. But the creature was fast, too fast. It whipped around, its movements unnaturally smooth, as if it anticipated their every move. Beth fired, her shot grazing the leader's shoulder, but it didn't even stagger. Instead, The creature turned its gaze directly onto her, and for a split second, Ava saw a flicker of recognition in those cold, undead eyes. "No!" Ava screamed, charging forward. But it was too late. In a blur, the leader lunged at Beth, grabbing her by the throat and lifting her off the ground. Beth's eyes widened in terror as she struggled, her hands clawing at the creature's grip. Ava's heart stopped as she watched in horror. "Beth!" Ava shouted, her voice raw with panic. Without thinking, Ava sprinted toward them, firing her weapon at the leader. But the creature dodged the shots effortlessly, its eyes narrowing in a predatory gaze. Ava felt a wave of frustration and helplessness flood over her. It wasn't just a monster. It was something more. Something that had evolved far beyond her understanding. Suddenly, Ray lunged at the creature's side, his knife flashing as he slashed at its exposed ribs. The leader snarled, dropping Beth as it turned to face the new threat. Ava didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, using the distraction to close the gap between them. With all her strength, she drove her weapon into the creature's side, aiming for its heart. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature just stared at her, its face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. Ava's heart pounded in her chest, the fear clawing at her. Then, something shifted. The leader staggered back, a strange, guttural growl rising from deep within its chest. Its eyes flickered, and for the first time, there was a hint of uncertainty in them. Ava's breath hitched. "It's weakening." Ray, still struggling to maintain his hold on the creature, gritted his teeth. "We need to finish this." With a final, desperate push, Ava drove the weapon deeper, aiming for the heart of the creature. The undead leader let out a high-pitched screech as its body went limp, the light in its eyes flickering out. Slowly, it collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The remaining undead halted, their once coordinated movements faltering. For a brief, breathless moment, the world seemed to stand still. Ava's pulse hammered in her ears as she looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had they really done it? Had they defeated the source of the undead? Then, as if in response to their victory, the remaining creatures began to writhe, their bodies twitching and jerking. Ava's stomach churned as the realization hit her. Killing the leader had only scattered the horde, but it hadn't solved the problem. The undead were still there, still a plague on the world. The war wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Ava turned to the others, her face grim. "This isn't over. But we've got a chance now. We find the source. We end it, once and for all." And with that, they prepared to leave the ruins, the weight of the world still pressing heavily on their shoulders. The fight was far from over, but one thing was certain, they were no longer just surviving. They were fighting for the future. And they would not give up until the last remnants of the undead were wiped out, no matter what it took. The ashes of the apocalypse still smoldered. But Ava and her group had ignited a spark of hope, a hope that would burn through the darkness.